Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Wario Land 2. In the last part, we got our second ending after wrapping up our first set of 5 hidden levels, and now we're heading back to Chapter 1, Story 5 in order to get the next alternate exit to start the next set of 5. So, this set of 5 was honestly a little weird to find in the fast way, but pretty easy to find in the slow way, if that makes sense. Because the easiest way to actually find this is to go into the boss fight and fail the boss fight and get ejected from the room, as the room that ejects us to is pretty close to where the alternate exit is. You can just go around the main room the way we did when we first were in this stage to get some coins and use the door up that way to reach this area as well, but getting turned into an egg and ejected out of the room is faster ultimately. Once we're here, we want to grab those coins, but then shoulder charge through this wall on the right, and this will bring us to a room where we can roll down and we'll ultimately find ourselves at the door. Worth noting, the alternate exit from Chapter 1, Story 1 is easily the fastest one in the game. The others all take a little bit of effort to actually try and find and reach, and I appreciate that, but I do wish it were kind of funnily similar. Welcome to, I guess, the other alternate Chapter 2, Go to the Cellar. Story 1, defeat the giant spearman once again already. Like I've said earlier in the LP, that is the ultimately most common mission type in the game, outside of just finding a gold ore in some form. So, we're now in a cave system, of course. One of the main mechanics of this entire chapter is light. In specific, switches in these levels are more likely to actively, instead of swap block states, turn lights in one room on, but at the same time, another one off. Worth noting, like with several other games that have some sort of darkness platform like this, the platforms that you use are always there. So if you've played the game before or are just jumping around trying to feel your way through, you can potentially just find your way through that. In fact, later on in levels with this mechanic, I do at times just decide to say, screw it, I'm not going to go turn that light switch on, I know where the platforms are. Go from there. But it really depends on whether or not it's your first playthrough or not, or if you really want to take the time and patience to do that, as there's times where it's just going to be faster to not do that, because you will see where the platforms are directly. But there are times you will have to memorize where they are, and then go turn the lights on, because you'll need them more in the next area after that. Oh, also I never talked about that distinct enemy right there. By and large, most of the enemies in this game that don't inflict states on you are pretty easy to deal with and all that. But I, for some reason, have the most bizarre issue with these little purple shell enemies we've seen, I think as early as Chapter 2, Story 1. The way they work is they bounce towards you, and there are hitboxes as they do so. You can hit them in the back, or you can just bump into them to make them nice and round, so you can just throw them at things. But I don't know why. I have a hell of a time avoiding them, personally. It's not like they're actively that dangerous, but I just, more often than not, if one shows up and it's in a thin area, I'm not going to be able to avoid it for some reason. I don't know why. It's definitely a personal thing. Maybe I'm just not patient enough when trying to get through these levels, but I almost always get hit, and it confuses me, but at the same time, it's also kind of funny, considering how consistent it is. This specific mallet ape I find placed very rudely. With that said, it is funny that you can just bounce into the switch over and over again. There is some coins above the light switch here you can use the mallet ape's spring form to actually reach. But if there's something that almost always happens when I play this game, I get hit by this mallet ape, go get those coins, hit the switch more than once on accident, and leave the room to find out I forgot to get the right world state. But that switch needs to be in the up state in order to get done what I want to get done. Which I know is the exact state it was when we went in that room, but that's because I only really went in there for the coins. What that switch will do is highlight the platforms in these 2 rooms. But I already know where they are, and if memory serves, that would make these rooms slightly darker, and I don't want that. So, I'm going in here manually, just knowing where it is, because that allows me to get to the treasure room as well as the exit on the other side a little more smoothly. Mind you, I say that, here in the room where the treasure room is, you absolutely could have this room on in the dark. Because you just need to feel out where that gap is over there in the thin platforms. Which, if you just walk slowly, you can find pretty easily. The issue then will be trying to figure out where the door is here on the bottom, because you won't be able to see it. For the end of the stage, though, you definitely want to have the lights on in this state that we're in right now, as getting to the giant spearman from the room on the right is a little more precise platforming-wise, because it's a pretty long vertical chain of thin platforms you have to kind of feel out in a way that I don't think would be very easy or fun to do. Because these are relatively far enough jumps where the trial and error wouldn't be worth the pain in my eyes. I'm not going to the right, that does lead to some extra coins, but at this point I'm just like, yeah, no, I want to finish the level. You're used to the giant spearman by now, you know how to deal with it. I'm surprised they never made a second variant that just tries to mess with you a little bit, but I guess that's what the boss fight was last time at the end of the day. Enough butt stomps to its own butt, and you get another 100 coins, and thus this stage is over. And we're going to be moving on to Chapter 2, Story 2, which, from my memory, is one of the few times where there's an active sort of mechanical difference between the Game Boy Color and Game Boy releases of the game. Welcome to Alternate Chapter 2, Story 2, Avoid the Rocks. The rocks that I mentioned are the main mechanic for this stage, and they'll fall out of the large holes we see in the background here again. There are two types that fall out of those holes. Small rocks, which you can grab and then throw, and large rocks that will fall on top of you and flatten you or any enemies. Now, a notable difference between the Game Boy and Game Boy Color release actually is how the rocks will interact with each other. Namely, in the Game Boy release of the game, if you're holding a smaller rock and a larger rock falls on top of you and it, the larger rock will get destroyed and the small one will fall out of your hand. Here in the Game Boy Color release, though, the small rock gets destroyed and then you get flattened instead. Ultimately, it's a very minor difference, but I can imagine it causes just a little bit less headache in the case you're trying to get flattened in one way or the other. With that said, if you're trying to use the small rocks or something, it's definitely an annoying change in that metric. In either case, the really annoying thing about the rocks when you're trying to get them to show up is that while they show up in set locations, their spawning is random. Sometimes you'll get 2 or 3 small rocks in a row, sometimes you'll get 2 or 3 large rocks in a row. It's just random. I think it is just a straight up 50-50 chance in either case, so you shouldn't be waiting around too long if you're waiting for one or the other. But I can see that being annoying to some people. From my own experience, probably the hardest and most annoying thing about this mechanic set to me, though, is actually grabbing the small rocks. Because you really do have to come to, like, a complete standstill as close to center as you can below the hole, and usually jump and hold up to grab a rock, rather than, say, just standing still to hopefully get it. If you can jump into it, even better. I think you can also, like, just barely press the button when they're right next to you. But even then, that's pretty iffy. And I don't know why. This is, like, the only thing, especially in practice, rather than on recording, because if I screwed it up enough, I would just restart the level recording. In practice, it's the only type of grabbing in the game I have issues with. Grabbing enemies, unless there's a ceiling above me and all that, it generally works extraordinarily well. Just for some reason, these rocks are iffy in my own experience. Maybe I'm just doing something wrong? I don't know. No matter what, though, overall best advice, try to do it from a standstill rather than trying to pick one up along the way, moving into it, as they'll likely just have you try to move past it, or accidentally even throw it in some cases. Sometimes just pausing is all you need in that regard. Also, something I haven't talked about yet, speaking of pausing, there's no real reason for me to pause in this LP, but if you do, you actually do get to see your total amount of coins at any point in time that's, like, stockpiled. I really don't get why, considering the only thing that would really impact is whether or not you know you have enough to do the upcoming matching mini-games, maybe, in the case you have run low on coins at this point, doing those up to this point, but eh. Also, something I really should have mentioned much earlier in the LP. Worth noting that this is not the first game that the music for the minigames is from. That was actually first used in Donkey Kong 94, the Game Boy game that's more of a remake slash reimagining of the arcade game with added mechanics that eventually became the Mario versus Donkey Kong series to begin with on the Game Boy Advanced onwards. I'll cover that game at some point. I also, for some reason, almost always refer to it as Donkey Kong 95, and I can't tell why. Despite how constantly the rocks do drop out of the holes, if you're trying to jump around them, they're not that big of an issue. There's only really, like, 3 levels in the game at most, I'd say, that actually have genuinely difficult platforming. And we're not going to see most of them until later on in this set of 25 hidden levels. Won't lie, though, I did actually miss the treasure room on this level on my first playthrough, albeit in retrospect, I missed it rather sillily, because they do mark where you can charge through to get it, no problem. Because like I mentioned, the game does a good job. If there's something that it actually matters hidden in a breakable wall, they'll usually find some way to mark it, like some off tiling, or, in this case, placing coins where it could be. I think on my first playthrough, I just assumed that was a group of like 6 coins that I only grabbed half of and all that and left it at that, but no. While there's a breakable wall right here, there's also one on the opposite side where the other 3 coins are, which is where our treasure hunting room is for this particular stage. At this point, though, let's dive back into the game's staff to talk about the next member listed in the credits. The next role listed is the package and manual designer, which that role is pretty straightforward in what it does. In this game's case, it was Yasuo Inoue. Their first game was as a designer on Metroid 2. They were then in the special thanks to Mario Paint and a package designer for Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins. They did printed artwork for Super Metroid. They did artwork for Tellero Boxer. They were manual editor for Mario's Tennis, as well as a printed artwork person for the Virtual Boy Wario Land. They did a lot of artwork for Fire Emblem in general, starting in Fire Emblem 4, and I think they stayed with that series all the way through to the second Ike game, which is a pretty long time. They did the package design stuff for Metroid Zero Mission. They did some artwork for some of the early WarioWare games and Wario Land 4 for that matter. They designed some pilot characters for F-Zero Maximum Velocity. Star Fox Command they did some artwork for. Wii Fit, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games 1 they did the work for. Glory of Heracles on the DS they did some artwork for. They did a lot of artwork in general for packages or otherwise. The last 2 credits they have for doing artwork for, on Moby Games at least, are for Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D and Dillon's Rolling Western on 3DS for artwork. Otherwise, all their credits after that are for manual editing, stopping in 2015, with their last few games being Kirby and the Rainbow Curse, Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon, and Xenoblade X. Which means, technically speaking, I'm assuming this credits will get another review in that regard technically soon once the Switch version that releases early next year. Next up is technically the special thanks, but I want to do that category last as those are the most people to talk about there. For right now, let's move on to talking about the game's producer, Takahiro Izuchi. He is super old blood Nintendo. He started working there in the mid-70s before video games was their focus. Some of his earliest products were when he was on toys rather than games. So he was on their early game stuff like Game & Watch and the Color TV game type stuff. He eventually became the general manager of Nintendo R&D 1 after Gunpei Yokoi left the company. He retired in 2018 or so. As for his game credits, though, he's usually in special thanks early on. Mario Land, Balloon Kid, Metroid 2, Battle Clash, Mario and Wario, Super Metroid. Moving forward all the way up until Game & Watch Gallery on the Game Boy, he is listed as special thanks exclusively, except for Tellero Box, in which case he's on Virtual Boy's development staff. However, once you hit the late 90s, particularly around 98 with Star Stacker, Super Famicom Wars, Famicom Detective Club Part 2, Pokemon Red even, he started becoming a producer more and more often as he started gaining more responsibilities. He's listed on producers games like Fire Emblem 5, Pokemon Gen 2, Wario Land 3, Sin and Punishment, Pokemon Puzzle League, Wario Land 4, Dr. Mario 64, the early Starfy games, Metroid Fusion, Pokemon Gen 3 and its spin-offs, Fire Red and Leaf Green and all that. But towards the later end of the 2000s, he started taking on fewer responsibilities, at least in terms of actual credited roles. His last credits overall are the Wii release of Sin and Punishment 1, Picture Book Games Pop-Up Pursuit, and then Smash 4 as a supervisor for the original games that were included therein. It's kind of weird to think about, though, like, there's still some members of Nintendo's old guard that have been around since the company was entirely focused on toys and board games. I think technically Miyamoto, for instance, joined at that period. But we're gonna, like, in the next decade or so, come on a paradigm shift where people like him just leave game development, period, because of either their age or the other option. And it's just gonna be weird, because I can't help but wonder if that's what made early Nintendo work so well with making video games, is that they really did have experience with making fun toys, especially first. Even compared to, like, other major Japanese studios that have been around forever, or especially things here in the West, like, I think technically Sega's earliest things were slot machines, and Capcom, I think, started in software development effectively, even if they weren't Capcom at the time. Either way, moving on to Alternate Chapter 2 Story 3, we're back on another train we have to stop, and structurally this stage is pretty identical to the one from early Chapter 4 on the main campaign. It's just a lot more dangerous, and it's, I guess, supposed to be in the cave because we're on I guess, effectively a minecart track at the end of the day. What's really weird about this stage is you think they would do more with the wind mechanic here on the roof of the train, but they really don't, but I think there's some potential they could have done there for slightly more complicated platforming. But I think it would be needed? Not really, but it could have been nice. I guess already, though, in some regards, you can consider levels that are this similar to another one earlier in the main campaign, just effectively a hard mode variant to that stage, and that largely works for absorbing them, especially if you approach them at about the same pace you did the original level. But with how many levels on the hidden 25 stages are largely original what they do, it does seem a bit out of place at points. At this point, though, let's start diving into the game's special thanks section. Like I've already mentioned, there are extra people credited in that depending on whether or not you're playing the Game Boy Color version or not. In the original Game Boy release, the people credited are Shinya Sano, Hirofumi Matsuoka, Masahiko Mashimo, Jim Warnell, and Kayomi McDonald. But the Game Boy Color version adds Kota Fukui, Tomoyoshi Yamane, Isao Hirano, as well as Nintendo R&D 1's generalized credit and the Super Mario Club's generalized credit to that list. To start with the two entities in that list that aren't individual people but instead are groups, Nintendo R&D 1, as we've covered previously on the channel, was one of early Nintendo's tour de force manufacturing and programming teams started by Gunpei Yokoi after he created the Ultra Hand for Nintendo. The Game & Watch stuff, the Game Boy, the Virtual Boy, a lot of early NES games like Metroid, Kid Icarus and all that, those are all him. If there was a game you really liked on the early Game Boy, likely they were involved in it at some way. But eventually they were absorbed into software planning and development in the early 2000s. Alternate Chapter 2, Story 4, Find the Exit. I found the exit. Level over. Now we actually have to get up there. But we can't because this room's dark, and while there's platforms up there you can jump on, we can't reach them from the floor, so we need to go all the way around to find a way to get to there. Notably, I believe R&D 1's final game pre-restructuring into the team that it and R&D 2 were kind of merged into, I believe was Metroid Zero Mission. You know what? They went out with a goddamn banger. That is still my favorite Metroid game all these years later. Dread gets really close in a lot of regards, but there's something about Zero Mission's hidden pathway and level design that just hits so good for me. Now, the Super Mario Club, as people have otherwise covered, is effectively one of Nintendo's oldest and longest running sub-facets. They are for game testing and debugging largely. They've been doing things since Dr. Mario on the NES, but if there's a major Mario release you really like, even if it's like a spin-off, starting from then up to even this year, they're in the credits for it. I think the most recent thing was Luigi's Mansion 2 HD they were in the credits for. But if not that, they were in Princess Peach Showtime, the Mario RPG remake. You've seen them in credits if you've played a Mario game or spin-off in the last 20 years or so. Call it a hunch. Since our goal here is to just reach the exit, there's no real standout mechanic here, though. They largely combine things from the first stage in this chapter, with things like the elevators from the Chapter 4 stage we've seen a lot of up to this point, in a way that really does feel organic, but doesn't really stand out in any super strong way. This game, again, doesn't really have that many, like, bad levels, but every now and then there's one that just kind of falls into my memory banks in a way that means it's not exactly the most memorable. This is honestly one of them. Again, they largely get rid of this issue in the sequels by effectively having the stage count. With the exception of Wario Land Shake It, I forget if I mentioned this when I was talking about that already, but Wario Land Shake It does get close to the scale of Wario Land 1 level-wise, but with the break between that and the previous game for one thing, but also with the amount of things mechanically Shake It does have going on, it at least felt right there. Plus, they made all those frames of animation for all those character sprites. You're damn right they're going to use them a lot if they can, because my god, Shake It sprite work is unreal levels of great. Every now and then I think about the size of Wario's sprite sheet in that game in specific, and just am in awe. To the point where sometimes I wonder if that's really why they never did another Wario Land after that, where they were just like, yeah, we really can't go up from this on a production scale. And there's something valid to that, I think. Like, knowing when to say you're done with something in that regard, I think is a good skill on a personal level. Especially given by that point how much of Wario's identity had already kind of become WarioWare in spin-offs. So I get that in that regard, if that's the case. But, man, I would love to see a new one of these. Mind you, at least we're at a point now where we're getting games inspired by what this specific series becomes as of Wario Land 4 specifically. Things like Pizza Tower, which I still need to really play and check out, because that looked great. I just was busy playing other games while that was the big hot thing. But thinking about it, I genuinely can't remember what I was playing at that point. Because that released, what, about January, February 2023? That was before I did my major Trails marathon, because I did that starting with Ozer's eventual English release in, I think that was March of that year. Then I just kind of marched through the Cold Steels into even the fan translations for Daybreak 1 and Daybreak 2 by like June or July. But from that, what I was doing early in the year, I genuinely cannot remember. I can remember what I was doing at that point this year because that was a High 7 Rebirth era. But, I think there's a way for you to actually have the lights on in this section, but I've felt that one out well enough to the point where I remember where the platforms are, so I don't really feel like I need to at this point, especially having done a practice run right before the recording of this specific level. Additionally, I think there's a way where you can get some extra coins coming up here right next to the exit, where you can just kind of head back towards where you started the level, but I end up not doing that because at this point, I got everything I need. This is one of my lower finishing scores on a level, admittedly, but it doesn't really matter with the amount of money I have stored up. I would actually recommend having the lights in the opposite seat that I do right here, though, on a first run, just so you don't accidentally fall off right next to the gold door, as the platform that the gold door is on does have a gap, I think, just to the side of it that will make you fall right back down to the entrance. And as someone who's had that happen, would not recommend it. It's not really hard, it's just annoying when it happens. But with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 11, we're gonna continue and finish off alternate chapter 2 before moving on to our next ending, and then subsequent next alternate chapter. See you guys then.